Shikamaru is a very relatable character. People really identify with him. And one of the reasons is that Shikamaru likes to avoid problems. Who doesn't, right? Shikamaru wanted a calm and peaceful life without too much excitement or work. He's a character who prioritizes a sense of calm above anything else. And for these reasons, he calls himself the #1 at running away and also considers himself a coward. The British philosopher Alan Watts once said, "The meaning of life is just to be alive." It's so clear, so obvious, and so simple. And yet everyone rushes around in a panic as if it were necessary to achieve something beyond themselves. Shikamaru would strongly agree with this statement. The philosopher Antisthenes, who was a disciple of Socrates, advised us to reduce the things we own to the basic necessities so that our souls may be free. Another great philosopher who could have inspired Shikamaru. But after all, does really living a simple life like Shikamaru's actually bring greater satisfaction? Shikamaru is different from the other characters, especially when we compare him to Naruto, who is the most motivated character in the anime. While all the other characters are striking poses that show how much they want to achieve, Shikamaru almost always appears with his hands in his pockets as if he's already satisfied with everything he has. A few months ago, I talked about Nike, who is a character that had no motivation to do anything, but Shikamaru is different. He enjoys a peaceful and simple life. Shikamaru had the famous dream of becoming a cloud. Being a cloud meant having no obligations. You would just exist, and you didn't necessarily have to do anything. Shikamaru also never had big ambitions like his peers. He just wanted to get married, have a simple family, as if that were easy, right? And have an average job. But that was the life of his dreams. The human mind is naturally inclined to complicate things, a concept known as papanka in Buddhist teachings. We tend to take a simple feeling or thought and like to layer it with interpretations and meanings, often without realizing it. This can lead us to build narratives, projecting into the future and anchoring ourselves in the past instead of simply experiencing the present. In other words, making life so simple isn't necessarily easy. Neuroscience tells us that our brains are wired for negativity and hate uncertainty. This means that even bad news can be better than no news at all. Generally, in the absence of facts, the brain makes up stories to fill in the gaps. Shikamaru, despite being quite intelligent, never seemed to question things much. His pleasures and goals are generally quite simple. The point is that he has a very high level of acceptance in life. That's something quite enviable. He is able to accept that he will have a calm and simple life. He manages to enjoy the simple moments in life. He likes games like shogi, which is a strategy game. If we compare it to the games of our generation, it's a tedious game, especially because our brains nowadays need a lot of stimulation. It's increasingly difficult to be satisfied with something more tedious like a simple game of chess, for example, or shogi. And we see this calmness in Shikamaru since he was a child in the friendship he has with Chuji. Chuji is his only close friend. He simply maintains this friendship for many years. Shikamaru likes to take the easiest path in everything. His teammate is Ino. He was never interested in Ino, maybe because Ino has a more assertive personality. She wanted a lot of attention, which is the opposite of him. Is this lack of motivation or this lack of ambition from Shikamaru actually a good thing? Well, it depends. First, we need to look at what we actually desire. In one of his letters, Seneca says to Lucilius, "In everyday speech, we often say that we are very happy that someone was elected consul or that another person got married or that his wife gave birth." Events that, far from being a cause for joy, are often the beginning of future sorrow. What Seneca is saying here is that we should be careful with our desires because they won't only bring us benefits. Wanting something a lot and achieving that desire won't necessarily bring you happiness. So in that sense, Shikamaru actually has an advantage, but it's a very fine line. Someone like Shikamaru could also be a very apathetic person. Lack of motivation, for example, could actually be a biological problem. An interesting study by researcher Valerie Bonelli shows the difference between the brains of highly motivated people and those with less motivation or who are apathetic. The researchers found that people who tended to be more apathetic had less streamlined brain connectivity between regions involved in deciding to make a muscle movement and actually making the movement. And this lack of efficient connectivity resulted in more activity and an energy drain in the premotor cortex. Remember that the premotor cortex is precisely the region of your brain, the central area involved in the decision to act. This area lights up milliseconds before other areas of the brain that control your physical movements. So for those who are less motivated, the premotor cortex seems to use more energy. In other words, Shikamaru's brain could indeed consume more energy to perform an action. This would explain much of his lack of motivation and tiredness. That is, for more apathetic people, taking action requires more effort. Maybe for Naruto or Kiba, it's easier to get motivated by a big challenge than it is for Shikamaru. This could be a biological issue, bringing it into our reality. Despite this point, another interesting study showed that this is not an unchangeable pattern. Any healthy person can change the functional connectivity of their brain by consciously changing behavioral habits and thought patterns. Our brain is plastic. Your mindset, your predisposition to be motivated or apathetic are never fixed. By consciously changing, like in Shikamaru's case, who, after getting older, didn't avoid conflicts just out of lack of motivation or laziness, and started to act more in certain situations, such as in the case of Suma. He was extremely determined and didn't hesitate to avenge his friend who died, and to protect Kurenai and her child. Sure, it could be a biological issue, but then there's the downside of not having ambition and many desires. As I mentioned in the Oikawa video, ambition can be something magical and incredible, and there are several studies that show it can drive you to have greater satisfaction with life. There's an interesting metaphor that tells the story of a young adult who is questioned by his father, who points out that his son doesn't have much motivation in life. The young man then says to his father quite honestly, "Dad, I don't care, I don't need much. I'd be very happy if I could spend the rest of my life in a garden just like the one you have." And then the man, instead of being moved by his son's words, simply says, "Son, I wanted to be prime minister and I ended up in this garden. If your big goal is to be here, I'm afraid of where you'll end up." There is a beauty in seeking to evolve and looking for more things. Our body, our brain was designed so that we don't get used to what we have, so that we don't settle. This can indeed be bad in some ways, as I've mentioned here a few times, but the reason is that this favored our survival and still does today. Our ancestors who survived were those who tried to seek more, and that made them find more opportunities for survival. So yes, ambition can be something extremely positive. Shikamaru accepts the downsides of not being ambitious, like knowing that he might never be remembered or that he won't achieve something grand like his peers. He accepts that. As this study shows, the truth is that many of us in fact will not achieve great things in life. 92% of people are unable to accomplish what they planned at the beginning of the year. So the chance of us getting frustrated in trying to reach what we aim for is quite high. Ambitions tend to be a double-edged sword. They can motivate you to the point where you have more energy to achieve them, but they can also frustrate you more than anything else in life. So if you think or feel similar to Shikamaru, maybe it's for a biological reason. Maybe your brain actually uses more resources to perform an action, or simply because you have a lower level of ambition than others. When we watch Naruto, we get the feeling that Shikamaru could achieve more things, even though he has already accomplished a lot. This is something that happens often in our society with ourselves. I, and maybe you watching me too deep down, feel that we could have achieved. Sometimes we rely on external sources for information, knowledge, belief systems, and entertainment. At the same time, we're sold the idea that our happiness comes from outside. Over time, we start to believe that everything desirable, satisfying, and rewarding, everything we want and need, comes from outside. Chika Amaro finds these values within herself without caring much about external values. The famous psychologist Abraham Maslow found that the happiest people were not necessarily the richest, most attractive, or most intelligent. They were simply those who lived authentic lives, fulfilling their potential and experiencing moments of deep joy and connection. Shikamaru would be that person who is able to appreciate the simple things in life, like sitting under a tree, just observing what's around him in a deep state of full attention. It's interesting that even in situations where he has to make an effort, and even though he's not inclined to do so, he still does something. He tries to overcome that. Because another thing he values greatly is social relationships, the people he cares about. The famous neuroscientist William James once said, "Action seems to follow feeling, but in reality, action and feeling go together." And by regulating action, which is more directly under the control of the will, we can indirectly regulate feeling, which is not. Therefore, if you put the cart before the horse, in terms of initiating motivated behaviors using your free will, I believe the neural pathways associated with the brain connectivity of a motivated person will eventually become stronger. In other words, changes can very well come from the outside in. Your action can motivate you to act more, and little by little, your behavior will change as well. Shikamaru is a very beloved character. Shikamaru is the one who most resembles our own selves, who just wants to stay quiet in moments of stress. Deep down, we enjoy those moments. Paying attention to the present moment and enjoying simple moments end up bringing more satisfaction to life. It's as if you hacked your brain to find pleasure in simple desires, in simpler things. At the same time, it's also good to have goals and maybe dreams that make you aim high as well. After all, life in a garden with family is wonderful. To reach that goal, maybe we need to aim a little higher.